Hello, this is Dean Radin, and I'm on Your Superior Self.
Hi, I'm Anita Murjani, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hello, this is Dr. Raymond Moody, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hi, Cultural Creatives. I'm Bruce Lipton, and I'm here to join you with Your Superior Self.
This is Paul Selig, and this is Your Superior Self.
What's up, everybody? I'm Aubrey Marcus, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hello, this is Ron Baker. Happy to be here with Trey Downs, discussing one of my favorite subjects, the journey toward your superior self.
That is the winner of all intros. Ron Baker, thank you for taking the time, my friend. Thank you for joining the show.
Yeah, it is a real pleasure to be here with you. As I was saying to you right before we recorded, I have really enjoyed listening to other episodes that you've done. So thank you for having me.
I appreciate that, man. I'm grateful for that. I'm very appreciative of your memoir. It's very honest and open. It gives insight to very vulnerable parts of your life.
Yeah.
Were you nervous at all, like releasing that to the public?
Whew. Believe it or not, that's the first time in any interviews that I've done that someone has asked me that question. So I really appreciate a chance to share it. I wrote a different book, which was the introduction to the process that I teach, wanting to help people. I gave it to a friend of mine who is a best-selling author at Hay House, and she said, Ron, this is your second book. You need to introduce yourself and share your journey because it's been so unusual as your first book. And it made great sense. But then I went into about 3 months of negotiating the feelings and the fears. And I was like, when I teach, when I'm one-on-one with people or in front of a group, I'll go anywhere. I'll share any part of my life that's relevant to helping people understand themselves. But to just put out the intimate details of my challenges, because that was the main thing, and the resolution of those challenges with no context was a scary prospect. And so I worked through it over the journey of the book, and now grateful to be able to launch it into the world without fear. Ready for it to touch and reveal for people whatever's perfect for them.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about some very vulnerable stages in your life, even your family dynamics. That's very tough, and I mean, I have to honor that and say, man, that good on you, dude. Not a lot of people can do that. Not a lot of people can be honest about their childhood and how their struggles, let alone their dynamics with their family. I mean, that's very personal. That's very personal, and it's not easily omitted when, I mean, people don't want to talk about their families now, let alone in a book that's going to be published by Hay House.
Yeah.
So I mean, let's start there, right? So because there's aspects of this book that are just amazing in nature anyway, with human consciousness. Let's talk about your childhood, right? Like you talk about in the book that you and your father never really had a conversation. So like, what did that look like? I mean, literally, were there no conversations?
Literally no conversations, not one. He was living right there in the house for the first 13 years of my life before my parents divorced, and not one single conversation to acknowledge me, which seeded all kinds of insecurity and self-doubt. So is it okay if I give a teeny bit of context for whatever we talk about for the rest of the way? What I do now, for those of you who are listening, is I have a school of self-mastery where I train people how to get in touch with self, how to resolve the wounding and the fear and shame of self, how to face our challenges and how to resolve them, as well as understanding the self on a much bigger soul level, understanding that our lives get set up so that the childhood is when the primary curriculum of a lifetime is set up. And then we have our adulthood to face it and deepen and resolve and whatever. And so I share it in that context because it made it much easier to share the deep challenge and the shame of having a father who never said a single thing to me. I share one particular focal point story in the book where my dad was a semi-pro athlete, and not one time did he ever invite me out into the yard to catch a ball or shoot a ball or whatever. And then at one moment, he decided it was time for me to go to the City League tryouts for basketball, and I'd never held a basketball in my hands. And so you can imagine it was totally humiliating, totally wackadoo. I mean, I could go into much more detail, but that's one of the centerpiece stories that set up my challenge of self-doubt. Well, the good news is in facing it, resolving it, and then learning how to help others go and identify theirs, I'm able to offer a context now of, yes, that sucked and it was challenging and there were so many layers and feelings to be faced in order to see deeper perspectives and heal the wounded stuff, but to help people understand that their challenges are there as the soul's way of saying, this is where you need to focus. In my case, it was on self-doubt. You need to build a sense of self, trust of self-value, and in order to set that up, you need a very clear, inescapable challenge that's going to put that in the forefront of your life. So, context.
I appreciate that. I'm not very good at context. When I get excited about something, I'm just jump right in.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love the enthusiasm. Yep.
Well, I'm going to jump in it right now, and I'm sorry.
Yeah,
but,
please.
You sound very knowledgeable about healing, right?
Yep.
Your background is in theater and performance, right?
That was my first career.
That was your first career. You've been in over 60 performances, I think.
No, over 60 leading roles, probably 5,000 performances.
60 leading roles on Broadway?
Broadway and opera. I was mostly opera to begin with, and then toward the end of my career, I was thinking, I really love doing theater more than I love opera. I was just a slow learner. And then I shifted over and did Javert and Les Mis and the title role in Phantom and some things that I got to do in theater that were awesome. And that gave me a world education, and it allowed me to be up in front of people expressing feelings and exploring so much of human nature that it was great preparation for shifting over to becoming a bioenergetics therapist. Traditional shift, right?
Well, how do you make that shift? Like, what sparked that shift?
Well, I always wanted to help people and wanted my life to be about that. And I started out as a biology pre-med major, and I went to school on scholarships for the performing arts. And I thought, okay, well, my scholarships are going to pay for my path to becoming a doctor. But then it just unfolded, and the doors kept opening, and I eventually went, you need to listen to what your soul seems to be revealing. I didn't have those words at the time. I just called it my green light. It was like, it just feels right to go in this direction. Clearly, something is impelling you toward this. So I let go of the doctor path and focused on that first career that never stopped snowballing. I just eventually called it off and said, no, it's time to shift because, number one, people and connection are literally the most important thing in my life, partially because I didn't have it in childhood. The disconnection set me up to want and seek meaningful connections with people. And so my performing career, because I went from show to show to show to show to show, oftentimes 1 month at a time, I wasn't getting to develop those relationships. And the more that started to drive me crazy, the more I said, you know what, I'm going to use these last years, I wasn't thinking like that, but these years of my career performing to also prepare and train and become ready to do this other thing. And so becoming a bioenergetics therapist is where I headed. and turned that into a school of self-mastery. So it just was kind of a natural transition based on listening to my inner self.
What does that feel like? You said that inner knowing, right? Can you put that in the words and describe what that feeling feels like?
Yeah, it started when I was a little kid. When something was important, I would just kind of feel like this inner excitement, and someone would say something and it would just feel right. It felt true. And when someone handed me an appropriate line but didn't resonate with it, didn't practice it, didn't whatever, I got a contracted feeling and it felt untrue. So I learned, and I started calling that my green light when something was really important, and then listened to the contraction as well. And it has served me my whole life. And I think we all have those indicators if we start paying attention to self.
Sure.
But we live in a world that has not encouraged getting in touch with the inner self. So
Sure. What sparked your interest with, I guess, the knowledge that your friend, I think his name is Robert,
yeah.
was receiving from the beings Gabriel? Is that that's right?
Yeah, that's a big jump, and yeah, let's go there.
I'm like, yeah, let's go. Like,
Yeah, please. I love that. Jump in.
When did that feel right? Right? Like, when did you stumble upon the channeling of the Gabriel soul aspect or higher knowledge? And when did that feel right to you that you could kind of trust that information?
So from the time I was a little kid, and I'm literally talking 5, 6, 7 years old, I was looking around going, so much does not make sense. Just even hearing that we have one lifetime followed by this eternal heaven and hell just drove me crazy. And I go, if we only have one lifetime, why do some people live a few months and other people live for 100 years? Why do some people have money and opportunity and other people don't? Why do some people have intelligence and other people struggle? And on and on. I was asking this from the time I was a tiny person. And people didn't have answers. And so I stopped saying a lot of it out loud, but I went on a journey seeking answers because I had this inner nagging that there were deeper truths that would allow life to make great sense. And so I was searching and searching and searching and found teachers. And when I traveled for my performing, I literally sought out teachers and indigenous people and healers and all kinds of things, wanting to understand lots of approaches to deeper truths. And so when I came to New York to make my debut at Lincoln Center, Robert, the person you mentioned earlier, was the head of the makeup department at Lincoln Center. And we were on a bus to go do some out-of-town performances before doing the all-important debut in New York. And I heard him talking behind me on a bus, and he started telling about having a near-death experience. Where he literally floated out of his body. He could see his body on the bed. He then went through the tunnel of light and got to this space where it was more peaceful connection to everything than he'd ever even imagined. Then he heard a voice in his head that said, "You must go back. You have not learned how to love."
Wow.
And then he was literally found himself coming back to consciousness in his body. 3 years later, he was telling that story. 3 years later, we were sitting on the bus, and I turned around and I said, "Green light, I don't know who you are, but I know I'm supposed to talk to you." And that began a 22-year friendship that I finally found another seeker who was just as interested in understanding life, how it all works, what the deeper truths, how do we resolve, what is true fulfillment, what is the potential of self, all of those things. And within months of our meeting, we went to a meditation group, and that was the first time. So I'll tell a little more of the story. The woman leading the meditation group was getting us to close our eyes and breathe and calm so that we could focus on whatever she was going to guide us through. Well, a couple of minutes into breathe and calm, all of a sudden I heard Robert's voice, and so I opened my eyes to see why he would be interrupting the meeting. And then I immediately heard that this is not how Robert talks. And he had his first experience of receiving the energy of Archangel Gabriel, much like a radio receives information and energy through thin air, and it is received and comes out as logical words. Same thing was happening with this channeling. I'd never experienced channeling, but you better believe that child who had always been seeking answers was thrilled. And so he gave a very short message, and the woman leading it said, Robert Gabriel mentioned in his message that this is the first time you have channeled, but this is something your soul chose for this lifetime, but you always have a choice. You can let it come through, or you can shut it down. So, you know me, I was like, nah, please, please. So we ended up meeting what became once a week at first to bring in more information. The beautiful, nurturing specificity of the information about how to resolve the wounded self, and about what is happening on the planet, why it's changing so much and so fast, and what kind of challenges we together as a planet are going to face, and how to negotiate that, work with those expanding, accelerating energies to open to more of our potential. And so thousands of hours of the most amazing education came through. It didn't take me a while to trust that it felt true to me, but it took me a while to admit to people that I was talking to an archangel. That was, I came from Tinyville, North Carolina, so this was a stretch.
Sure. The Bible Belt, right? Like,
oh yeah. My grandfather was a minister.
Yeah, he was a Methodist minister, right?
Yep.
Did you tell any of your family members about this?
By the time this happened, my family was sort of used to my adventurous claim as much as I can of life, explore life, and but this was new. But I did tell my mother and two sisters, and I can't even really remember the beginning, before everybody just knew. And I invited them to come have an experience, and I started telling them the things that were being said. And again, the information is so universally beautiful, healing, nurturing, empowering. So there was nothing to push against. And so they just opened like I did, in their own ways, at their own pace. And that's how that happened.
Well, in the book, you're very open about your sexuality in the book. What was harder, coming out about your sexuality or talking about Gabriel?
Well, believe it or not, you're the first person who's asked me this part of the book as well, and I love that you did. But because it's new, you're going to see vulnerability come up, which is fine with me. This is what I had to work through in sharing the book with the world. Because not only was my sexuality so confusing to begin with, my spirituality was so expansive with Gabriel that I was like, because when I teach, I share about my life. Everybody in my life knows about me, all facets of my life that are relevant. It's no big deal, but again, with no context. So basically, growing up in Tinyville, North Carolina, when my desire to have a connection with my father then became a desire to have connection with my male relatives or close adult authority males in my life, and none of them were communicators. None of them saw me or responded or whatever. And so that just deep desire for that connection, Gabriel tells me, was the perfect setup for me to face this and open this particular challenge. So when all of a sudden I was like, what's happening? Now my desire to have communication, connection, and be seen also included attraction. I was baffled to begin with, because I thought I was the only person on the planet who felt this way.
Mm-hmm.
No one had ever said that a word existed for this. No one had ever talked about it. So I thought, oh my God, this is going to be the final nail in the coffin of separation and not feeling connected. Oh my God, this means that I'm always going to be on the other side of some invisible wall, and I'm different. Little did I know that there were millions of people around the world going through the same thing. But I had to go through this deep shame. And so I buried it, hid it, tried my best to compensate and just do what everyone else was doing. And basically it led to a culminating moment when I was 22, and I had put everything I could into dating the wonderful, I don't know whether to call her a young woman or a girl, we were in college, but dating the wonderful woman that was going to be my biggest litmus test. And at the end, I was like, uh-oh, I'm now at the age when people are going to talk about marriage, and she did.
Oh.
Do you think that maybe we're headed in that direction? And I was like, I cannot do this to her or to me. And so I literally used the excuse of going away to grad school, and I didn't want to have a long distance relationship, and called off the relationship with her. And then I couldn't live with myself.
Mm.
And I said, you know what? You have to share with her, because otherwise you risk that let that go down. That your challenge is going to cause her self-doubt, the very thing that you felt your whole childhood. You cannot be the impetus for someone else moving through their life in self-doubt. And so we got together before I left, and I said, I have to be really honest with you and tell you the truth. That I thought I would go through my life and never say to someone, but I now know, because of what we've gone through together, I can never put anyone else in this position again. I can't set someone up consciously knowing this is where it's going to lead. And so I have to tell you that I am a gay man. And we both cried and held each other, and it was truly profound. And it was the beginning of me being able to be fully authentic again, which was so important to me. But I didn't know how. I didn't know it would be possible. And so it was a freedom, but it also opened up, how do I negotiate this now? But she told me years later that after dating and being engaged and all kinds of things, she said, I want you to know that you treated me with more respect and honesty than any person that I have dated, and that will always be priceless to me. And just 2 days ago, she was texting me to say, I'm reading the book and this is this. And she was so moved by the whole thing. And so, yay for happy endings that can come out of the courage of authenticity. So that's some of the journey around the sexuality.
Man, I thank you for sharing that. It's not easy to be vulnerable, and it's not easy to share things like that and show emotion. I can everyone who's going to watch this can see that emotion arising, and then you dealing with it and breathing as it comes up and just kind of grounding yourself in that story. Thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
I just think it's so important for people to see that we're human beings, and even as a male, right? Like, it's important for us to be able to demonstrate that in public and on shows like this,
Yeah.
that it's okay to be vulnerable. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's not weakness.
Oh no. Yes.
Because there's that stigma that there's weakness behind showing your emotions, right?
Thank you so much for saying it. It's so true. And it's such a shame that we have lived in a world that is afraid of feelings for the most part, particularly charged feelings or vulnerable feelings. And so that's also a part of what the focus is in the work that I do. A central part is helping people understand how to get in touch with that in themselves, and that there's no threat. So as an example, I just shared the story, and it was moving to say it out loud in this context, but there was no threat to my adult reality at all. And so 25 years into teaching this kind of process, I'm so happy to say to my clients who are just beginning to negotiate it, not one client in 25 years has ever discovered a feeling that was threatening to them when they approached it in this way. And that is profound.
Absolutely. You talk about the three aspects of self: the child, the adult, and the soul. When you feel that emotion come up, when you talk about you having that conversation with a loved one, what aspect of that self are you healing, or what are you feeling?
So thank you for giving me the chance to share about this map of self. I think we have lived in a world that has almost ignored self. We're going to develop skills. We're going to go out and make money, create some structures, have some children, and no talk about self. So I went to school for 20 years. I got 3 degrees beyond high school. Not one course focused on self, much less the inner self. So in my journey and learning how to connect to the inner self, believe it or not, in giving you the background and context, I kind of lost the focus of your question. Would you say again, so I can tie it together to what the map of self.
Map of self. So, but I want to know
yeah.
specifically, like when you had that feeling, when you had that emotion arise, do you know exactly what part of the self that you're healing, or is it just kind of like you got to work through it to see if it's the child, the adult, or the soul?
Well, ultimately, it doesn't matter which facet is included in the feelings that come up, but do we have an adult who can approach it and feel safe with it and nurture it and allow it to come through? So if it was the child and certain percentages of the child that were coming up just then, no problem. But if there's not an adult who has learned to feel safe with those feelings, what we do is we continue to shut it down and bury it, just like I did for my whole childhood. And so it can be a part of all 3 facets of self, and yet it comes up in the lower body, which is where the child lives. That's where the emotional energy center is. And then the heart center is where the conscious mind of the adult is centered. And then we have the higher self, which is where the soul, higher will is centered. So the energy wants to awaken, come up to the heart to be felt, and then expressed and released. And then it is a complete cycle of allowing those feelings. But most of the time, the child feels the feelings and they never learn to feel safe with them. Nobody said when we were young, "Oh, I see that you're feeling sad." "Oh, yes, I guess that's what it is. You're totally safe. I'm right here. Please share your feeling." We didn't get this kind of emotional education. So the child feels the feelings and it wants to come up, but we grip right here in the solar plexus and we squash it back down. And then it just builds up and builds up and builds up. So teaching people how to reconnect, feel, express, and release the pressure cooker of people's lives, their anxiety, their stress, their inflammation, all drops in a very consistent, reliable way. So much of it is feelings. So there's some answer to the question.
Beautiful answer, my man.
Thank you.
Beautiful answer. when you clear that energy, I mean, it's a life's work, right? Like you're basically, are you clearing past lives too when you're doing that?
Well, you love the complicated questions. I love that. So I have an answer. If you ask it, I'm going to give you my take on it. So often I've watched people come to Gabriel and say, Gabriel, tell me about my past lives so that I understand. And he said, the bottom line is, if it is a core issue in this lifetime, you can guarantee you have soul history with this issue. So when you heal this feeling, this particular pattern, are you just healing it for this lifetime? He also said you hold the memory of every single lifetime in every cell of your being. Mm-hmm. Scientists haven't known what the DNA is encoded with, and up until recent years, in the last decade, they considered 90% of the DNA junk DNA. Mm. And now we're discovering it holds so much more potential. This is part of the deal. It's energetically encoded in our being. And so, can I give a practical example? Mm-hmm. So, when I went to Egypt, leading a journey...
Oh, I love this. I can't wait for you. I couldn't wait for you to talk about Egypt. I'm sorry.
So, to give some context, Gabriel eventually asked Robert and I if we would lead the first of 15 journeys around the world, and he would tell us where to go, like Egypt or Machu Picchu, Peru, or the Potala Palace in Tibet, etc. And when we went on this very first journey, I'd never had conscious memory of past lives. And so I was resolving tons of feelings from this lifetime, which could impact the whole grid of my soul history. I just didn't know it that completely. So on this first journey to Egypt, we went to the very first temple, Abu Simbel, and I started having this sadness come up, and I didn't know what it was. It was just stirring. And then when we gave the group time to explore on their own so that they could have their individual experiences and we weren't controlling the whole thing as a group, I felt compelled to go up some steps to a particular statue, and I put my arm around the statue. It felt so illogical. Who's ever walked up to a statue and put their arm around it? But as soon as I did, I got a flash inside my head of having been a little boy at this very temple, holding on to this very statue, and I was looking out into the distance, waiting for my father to return on his ship from battle. And the memory awakened when I was told he was not coming back. And all of a sudden, I'm in the year 1997, remembering ancient Egypt, and the unexpressed feelings that I held from all the way back there, which were tied into me waiting for my own father, who was sitting right there, to reconnect with me, allowed huge waves of sobbing to come up and out, and healing this lifetime, healing a lineage of lifetimes. It's powerful.
It is powerful. Because going back to your father, you guys didn't have a real relationship. Your parents got divorced and he kind of left the picture. But then you reconnected. Did you reconnect after Egypt or before Egypt?
Before.
Let's talk about that. That conversation is very powerful.
Yeah, I was in the process of working with Gabriel for a while, but not a long time, within the first year. And it's when I was making my debut, I believe. It was one of the first years of being at Lincoln Center. And my father was going to be coming to see me perform, which he never did. Never. This was unheard of. Only one other time could I think of a visit. And so when I was talking to Robert about this, the subject of a particular difficult time of middle school where my sexuality was awakening. My mother was an alcoholic because of what was going on in their relationship, and my father was just shut down and unavailable. When we were talking about this, he said, yeah, I think that you should ask your father for his perspectives. And this rage came out of me. He wasn't even there. And Robert said, interesting timing. Your father's coming this week. And I was like, oh. I jumped up and ran and phoned him. I'd never asked for anything personal. This was like me having a major wake-up call. And I said, Dad, when you come to visit, is there any way you and I can have some alone time? I realize I know nothing about you, your life, your history, how you felt about the family. I know nothing. Could I ask you some questions and whatever? And he paused, but then he was willing. And the long and short of it is, between that moment and when we spoke, I realized I'm no longer a 5-year-old yearning for my father to talk to me. I'm now an adult. I'm in my late 20s. And half of the responsibility of our relationship is now mine. So let me show up and take some first steps and see how willing he is. And basically, when I sat down and asked him specific questions so that there was some structure for sharing, because he was not used to sharing about himself, he literally talked for 3 hours.
Wow.
Couldn't, it was like I was hearing about another person that I'd never met. And it was remarkable to get to know some of his humanity. And he said something similar, that he didn't think anyone was interested to know about him. So he too had self-doubt, and this was so healing for me to realize, because I thought I was the one who was insecure and he was this warrior athlete, totally confident being, and to find out about his wounding was so helpful.
What did that heal inside of you?
Well, it gave me what I call some adult reality. We end up frozen in the perspectives of the child, and most people never challenge those. I don't care if they're 80. They end up with these perspectives, and that's the end of the deal. This is the limit. These are the rights and wrongs. And so what I introduce my clients to is the child was the setup of the curriculum of the soul. But there's a verse in the Bible that says, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. Well, I'm like, what in the hell truth is that? What? Nobody ever explained anything. It's just a verse. And then as I was having these experiences, I was like, oh, wait a minute. There are deeper adult truths that your child had no way of knowing, deeper adult truths and even soul truths that shall set your wounded child free. Now, all of a sudden, the words made such sense, and I was thrilled to not personalize. The reason he hadn't spoken to me was because I wasn't lovable or worthy of his time and attention. He just had no clue. His father died when he was a little boy. He had no modeling. He literally didn't even know that he had been ineffective as a father, which he admitted in that conversation. So, wow, it healed so many things, or it became the seeds of healing. I still had to process the feelings, but I had some healthy new perspectives to re-educate the child part of myself, and that meant the world.
Did you guys develop a relationship after that?
Well, not until the end of his life. We got along, but there was no continued sharing much more than just that couple of years. And then he went back to his, what I consider a very self-involved not capital S self, a very me life, and he didn't really engage that much. And then at the end of his life, he ended up having to have his right leg, excuse me, have his right leg amputated between the knee and the hip because of a sore and lack of circulation in his leg. And my two sisters and myself showed up like a big dog, and we were there for him. And the more vulnerable he became, the more it woke him up. And literally, you can imagine losing your leg. That's a hard one to wrap your head around, the challenge. And 2 days in, he slaps that part of his leg that's still there, and he says, "You know what this leg is? It's a second chance for families." We were like, "Who are you?" And he then started opening up and sharing, and all the stuff he'd been holding down, and he affirmed each one of us in different ways. And my father was a very proud, as I've already called him, warrior athlete. And so he never allowed himself to receive or be vulnerable in any way that I could tell. Mm-hmm. And I literally had to pick up his, let's say, 220-pound body under his arms and lift him from the chair into the bed before he learned how to do it himself, completely vulnerable that I could drop him. Mm-hmm. And he literally chose to trust me, and allowing the fact that we were there for him in a way that he had never known how to be for us, but he saw the consistent love and nurturing that came out of each of us having done a lot of the inner work. Profound at his, well, I don't want it to seem like he passed away from this leg. He did not. He became an inspiration during that time. And then later that year, he got an infection that was nothing to do with the leg and ended up passing away. But at his service, I was baffled that I was expecting to feel not much of anything at my father's death. And I wept out of gratitude that we had such a resolution, because most people don't end up getting that. A resolution and an understanding that I love you, and he was able to show his love in ways that he never had, said some of the most beautiful personal messages that are in the book. And what I love is a bunch of my entrepreneurial friends who are very A-type leader types have said to me, "Wow, your journey makes me want to resolve my relationship with my father." That is priceless. That is the gift of what my father and I went through together can be in the world. And that's why I shared the story. Certainly wasn't to dishonor him. It was to show what is possible when we do the inner work and show up willing and courageous.
Looking back at that relationship, how dynamic it is, do you find gratitude towards everything that happened?
I do. Now that I have moved out of being trapped as the wounded child and moved into not only adult, but the initiations of soul consciousness, which is a whole other subject. But now that I've moved into seeing the perfection of life, and remember how I said as a child, I just knew there were answers that would allow life to make sense, and it would be fair, and it would be loving versus my confusions as a child. And that has happened. And I do feel so much clearer about life and the way it operates. And so I'm able now, having processed a lot of the feelings and the anger and the hurt and the confusion, able to feel deep gratitude for all the players in my life and the roles that we've played for each other in the learning curves, etc. That's pretty sacred. Yeah.
Talking about that soul consciousness or that soul level of being, how much are you in that space now?
Speaking of gratitude, I have now had 33 years with archangelic guidance. And part of that was understanding that the planet is waking up into a level of evolution that is unprecedented. And that for the first time, soul level consciousness is attempting to awaken in our lives in a direct way, not just behind the scenes, setting up the curriculum and attracting situations for us to hopefully face that curriculum. So the planet is waking up, and the energy is so much higher, which is what is stimulating all the change on the planet, including waking up consciousness, which is lovely because we've advanced more in 30 years than we've advanced in 3,000 years prior. And so within this awakening, the opportunity to resolve the child, claim the adult, and then open into levels of potential that most of us never even imagined.
Mm-hmm.
That level of connection and healing and intimacy and gifts of intuition and even telepathy and various things that I live and know are possible. I don't tend to talk about too much of the soul stuff just because I don't want to sound sensational, but I've said to people for years, when someone can perform what is perceived as a miracle to someone else, it's not a big deal to the person who's doing this level. Just like even when people go, oh my gosh, when you open your mouth to sing, it must be unbelievable that that's what comes out. And I go, no, that's what comes out. So I'm just singing. And so it's sort of a parallel with the soul level. When we reach these deeper levels of potential, it makes life so much more meaningful. That's why I dedicated my life to doing this, because to watch thousands of people from around the world blossom and free themselves from their own challenges, fear and shame, into more and more meaningful experience, more fulfillment of self, it's priceless. And so I live very immersed in an awareness of the soul at this point. Yes.
Do you receive messages from the Gabriel, Archangel Gabriel as well?
Yes. So because I didn't want the book to be too confusing up front, it was Robert bringing through these messages and me learning as the student and then reparenting my own inner child. That was plenty for the audience in the book to get used to. I don't reveal until the end, when certain things occur that I'll leave unspoken at this point, that I eventually had to admit, that's a weird way of saying it, I eventually needed to reveal that I too, a couple of years into the process, had discovered that I could channel, but very differently than Robert did it. Very differently. And so I've been grateful to be able to continue to bring through messages and put them out in the world and continue to enhance and gather even more layers of education. Yeah.
So Robert had more of a, he channeled that vocally, right? So I'm assuming you channel thought forms or like downloads?
So let me explain, I guess, the difference between a trance channel and a conscious channel. Robert was not clear enough as a person when he first started to channel Gabriel. Neither of us had known how to do the inner work. And so his early life was set up so that his higher energy centers were wide open because he had a lot of trauma and he wanted to escape the physical. Mm-hmm. And so that gave him the gift of being very wide open. So when the energy of Gabriel connected with him for the first time, he felt, oh my God, there's this energy moving in my body and I don't think I'm going to be able to stay conscious. And he went asleep. He went unconscious. So when he opened his eyes again, he had no idea that a voice had come through him and spoken to the group. He thought we were playing a prank on him. So then when it happened the second time, I recorded it for him and he could hear the reality of it, and then he loved it and moved into it. So he's a trance channel where he's not conscious of what's happening. I said to Gabriel once I was able to do it more telepathically, where I would hear inside my head the voice speaking.
Is it your voice or his voice? Or
it's not. It's not my voice at all. As a matter of fact, I've had different guides, but Gabriel has remained consistent. The very first guide that I learned to receive had a completely different accent, a completely different set of vocabulary that he used, and I got used to doing it, and I would listen and I would sit there at the typewriter and type out what was being said that I was hearing in my head. Eventually, I couldn't keep up even as fast as I type.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, I'm going to record. So I would record and then start to allow what I was hearing, and then it would bypass hearing it speaking, and it would just come through straight out of my mouth. And so I was conscious the whole time. As I was being trained for that, this is so wild that I'm having this conversation on a podcast. So as I was being trained for that, Gabriel would go ba-da-da-da-da-da-da, talking, and I would comment in my head, and he would stop. And he would go, no. You can't get in the middle of this. Don't comment. Don't have an opinion. Don't, just go blank and allow us to speak. And he stopped 20 times over the next months, and we're waiting for you to finish and get quiet. And then he would, and so I learned over time, just, you can ask your questions later or at the end of the channeling, but just stay out of it. And that's how that unfolded.
Wow. So many questions. And the hour is almost up. I cannot believe this, Ron Baker.
Yep.
So there's a second book, right? I mean, the first one's amazing. I loved every second of it.
Thank you.
Where can people find that? And
they can find it right here. It's called Bright Lights, Big Empty. And then the subtitle, A Journey of Profound Awakening. And it is literally a map of the journey that all of us are on, whether we're conscious or not. And you can either get it at Amazon, or you can get it on my website, ronbaker.net.
Ron Baker, this has been amazing. You have to come back on. Like, I enjoyed every second of this. I can't thank you enough, my friend.
Yay. Thank you so much for having me.